Welcome to a presentation in cost and management accounting. Our focus of attention in this presentation is on overheads and absorption costing. I'm your presenter, Behrman Kauseni. So from the outset, let us have a look at the learning outcomes for this particular presentation. So by the end of this presentation, we should be able to, one, explain the reason for using absorption costing. Two, describe the process of allocation, apportionment, reapportionment, and absorption in order to establish product cost in absorption costing. And lastly, and not the least, we are going to look at how to calculate overhead absorption rates. So, let us have a look at the introduction to absorption costing. In this particular slide, our focus will be to look at two things: the definition of absorption costing and its purpose. So what is absorption costing? Absorption costing is simply a method or approach of costing that includes all manufacturing costs. In this regard, we are looking at both variable and fixed costs in the costing of a product. So we are saying that absorption costing is simply a method or approach which is used to cost all manufacturing costs that relate to a product. Now, secondly, what is the purpose of absorption costing? Absorption costing essentially ensures that all costs of production are absorbed by the units produced, providing a comprehensive view of the product costs. We move on. Why are we supposed to use absorption costing as a business entity? So, absorption costing is basically required for financial reporting and accounting standards such as GAAP and IFRS. Apart from that, the purpose for which we use absorption costing is that it helps in pricing decisions by ensuring that all costs are covered. Thirdly, and not the least, why should we use absorption costing? Absorption costing provides the basis for inventory valuation on the balance sheet. Now we move on and try to appreciate the key concepts in absorption costing. The following are the key concepts in relation to absorption costing. The first one we're going to look at is allocation. So now the question is, what do we mean by allocation in the context of absorption costing? Allocation is essentially the process of assigning whole costs directly to a specific cost center or product. And examples which we can cite in this regard would include direct expenses, direct materials, direct labor costs, which of course are allocated directly to the product. So in simple terms, when we look at the concept allocation with particular reference to absorption costing, we need to appreciate that our focus is to look at all direct costs. And in this regard, we're looking at direct materials, direct labor, and all direct expenses. We move on to the second concept, which is apportionment. What is apportionment? With particular reference to absorption costing. Apportionment is the process of dividing indirect costs. In this regard, we are looking at overheads. So we are saying it's a process of how indirect costs can be divided amongst different cost centers. So when we are looking at apportionment, it is also important for us to look at the basis of apportionment, the basis upon which the sharing of these costs across different cost centers can be done. So the basis for apportionment basically entails us or indicates to us that overheads are apportioned based on a logical basis. In this regard, we are looking at apportionment being done based on floor area, say for example for rent, machine hours, say for example for electricity. So let us now try to cite some of the examples in relation to the basis of apportionment. So examples would include factory rent, which can be apportioned to different departments based on the floor space which is occupied by each department. We continue with the key concepts in absorption. After apportionment, we can look at reapportionment. What is the definition of reapportionment? Reapportionment is simply the process of redistributing service department costs to production departments. Reapportionment simply means that this is the process through which a business can be able to redistribute service department costs to production departments in the organization. So now we look at the purpose. What is the purpose of reapportionment? The purpose of reapportionment is essentially to ensure that all overheads are ultimately absorbed by the product. Now, if we appreciate the purpose of absorption costing, let us now try to look at the methods which we can use to achieve this. The methods, among others, would include the direct method, the step-down method, or reciprocal method. Let us look at an example. The maintenance department costs are reapportioned to the, sorry for that. In this regard now, we move on to absorption. Now, what is the definition of absorption? Absorption is essentially a process through which overheads can be charged to the product using an overhead absorption rate. And the formula for overhead absorption rate is simply equal to the total overheads divided by total absorption base. Now, we need to understand what is meant by an absorption base. Now, an absorption base is essentially the basis upon which an overhead absorption rate can be derived. So common bases in this regard might include direct labor hours, machine hours, or units produced. Let us have a look at an example. If total overheads are 100,000 kwacha and the total direct labor hours are 20,000 in number, then the OAR is simply equal to, following that formula which I gave you in the preceding slide, OAR is simply equal to total overheads divided by total absorption base. In this regard, if you look at our question, the data in our question, total overheads are given as 100,000 kwacha, and then the total direct labor hours are given as 20,000. So if we divide 100,000 kwacha by 20,000 labor hours, we are going to get 5 kwacha per labor hour. Okay, so at this particular moment, we are going to look at the steps which we can follow in absorption costing. Under absorption costing, the following are the steps which we can adhere to. The first step relates to the requirement for us to allocate direct costs. What do we mean by saying that we allocate direct costs? This simply means that we assign direct materials and direct labor to the product. After we've done the allocation, we can move on to apportionment. In this regard, we are saying apportion indirect costs. So what is the essence under this step? We are simply trying to distribute overheads to cost centers. The third step is to reapportion service department costs. What are we doing in this step or under this step? We are simply reallocating service department costs to production departments. Step number 4. Under step number 4, we need to calculate the overhead absorption rate. Well, under this step, what we are required to do is that we are simply being asked to determine the rate at which overheads are supposed to be absorbed by products. Remember, in order to come up with the OAR, I had actually given the formula which we can use in the previous slide. Then after that, we are told under step 5 to absorb overheads. What does it mean when we are told to absorb overheads under this stage? What is required of us is simply that we apply the overhead absorption rate to the product based on the absorption basis. For example, we can use labor hours, we can use machine hours. So if we have a look at this slide, it's basically a slide which is trying to show us the formula for OAR, overhead absorption rates. So as alluded to much earlier, OAR is equal to total overheads divided by total absorption base. For example, we can have total overheads of 200,000 and total machine hours of 40,000 hours. Therefore, overhead absorption rate will be equal to 200,000, which is the total overheads, divided by 40,000 machine hours, which relates to the total absorption base. Now remember, in some texts, total absorption base can also be referred to as the total activity level. So now, let us try to appreciate application, the application of this formula or the application of what we've done. So if a product uses 10 machines, for example, 10 machine hours, what would be the total overhead cost? I think you can try to do that in your spare time. Okay, we move on. Now, with regard to overhead absorption, it is important to acknowledge that there are a number of advantages as well as disadvantages associated with absorption costing. So what are these advantages? 1, absorption costing essentially complies with accounting standards of a particular country. Apart from that, absorption costing provides a full cost of production for pricing decisions. Thirdly, absorption costing also ensures that all costs are recovered in the selling price which has been set by the business. We move on and look at disadvantages. Absorption costing can lead to over or under absorption of overheads if actual activity levels are different from budgeted levels. Apart from that, the other disadvantage is that absorption costing may not be suitable for decision making as it includes fixed costs. So, with regard to the presentation which we have been subjected to, it's important to acknowledge that absorption costing is one that ensures that all production costs are included in product costs. Apart from that, the process involves allocation, apportionment, reapportionment, and absorption. Overhead absorption rates can be calculated or are calculated in order to assign overheads to products. Based on the presentations we've looked at, I would safely say that we have come to the end of our presentation. So see you in the next presentation which I'm going to make. So bye for now.